Here we are, back to Brighty of the Grand Canyon. We're at the next chapter. Brighty goes to work. Look at there. The next day, the president and Quentin left for Washington, and life settled back into routine. But Uncle Jim felt concern about Brighty. Was he becoming a plodding pack animal, forgetting his wild days, his memories of freedom? Uncle Jim decided to make a test. If Brighty would go to work for someone else, then it would be plain that all the wildness had drained out of him. What about young Homer Hobbs, he thought. Homer was the water boy for Wiley's summer camp. He was a gangly youngster with brown, doe-like eyes and arms too long for the rest of him. Though a shy one with the people, he had a pet deer and a skunk and a grouse, and he seemed easy and at home with animals. Uncle Jim made a point of arriving at the spring one morning when he knew Homer would be fetching water. "Homer?" he exclaimed as he caught up to the boy. "Maybe Brighty'd pack water for you, too." Startled, the boy looked around, his brown eyes gleaming with interest. "You mean," he hesitated, "I could have Bright Angel part-time?" "Maybe. Who knows? He's getting to be such a workaday feller, he might just be glad to help a neighbor out." Homer's shyness was suddenly gone. He looked straight into Brighty's eyes and then into Uncle Jim's. "I'd like that," was all he said. "'Tain't every man I'd loan him to, but even though you're only crowding 11, so you're almost turning 11. You're Cal Hobbs' son, and you come by your knack with animals natural. I swear I don't know what's got into him. Ever since he killed a lion, he's tame as a lamb." It was only a matter of days before Brighty was dividing his time between Uncle Jimmy's place and Wiley's camp. There was a handful of children at the camp, and Brighty enjoyed their generosity. Every time he gave a child a ride, he was rewarded with the most delicious treats. Licorice sticks or cherry drops or slightly squashed cookies. Sometimes it was a juicy apple, and so before long Brighty was hiring himself out as a child's mount. Of course, he went where and when he pleased and at whatever pace suited his fancy, but his gaits were so remarkably smooth that children took the riding with their arms outspread. "Look, Ma!" they would shout, "No hands!" But let some grown-up climb aboard to show the child how to ride, and Brighty turned demon. At the first kick into his ribs, he took off like a bird. Then, in mid-flight, he suddenly put on the brakes. The luckless man always flew over Brighty's head and landed like a frightened goose in front of him. Brighty's second-best trick was an about-face. He would be loafing along, head down, as if half asleep. Then, without any warning, he would wheel and gallop off in the opposite direction. The unfortunate rider never seemed to make the turn with him, but to go forward into space quite often ended up in a spiny bush. To make matters worse, Brighty had a way of looking back over his shoulder, showing his teeth in a wide grin. With Homer Hobbs and the children, Brighty was meekness itself, but he seemed allergic to grown-ups. Once, when Homer went to town on an errand, a stout, red-faced man took over his job as water boy. He brought out the tins and began to sharpen a pine twig with his knife. Brighty's eyes rolled knowingly. Quickly, he backed up, screening himself in a little grove of aspen. There he stood, motionless, his white nose matching the white bark and his eyes like the black bowls. The man cupped his fat hands to his mouth and shouted, "Brighty, you come here." When the burro did not come, the man stormed into the aspen grove and whacked his way through the pine stick, almost touching Brighty's tail. "Consnarn that fool Jack," he sputtered. "Where is he?" The madder he got, the more he yelled, and even though it was barely sun-up, the children, some still in pajamas, came running out of tents to see what the noise was all about. A sharp-eyed little girl spied Brighty and nudged her friends. They broke out in snickers at first, then they howled with mirth. "You kids tell me where he's at," the man lurched around, "and be quick about it." For answer, they only whispered behind their hands and laughed the louder. This threw the man into a rage. A second time he strode into the aspen grove and again passed right alongside Brighty, while the children's laughter mounted beyond control. It was one thing to be outwitted by a burro, but being laughed at by children was more than the man could bear. Snatching up the water tins, he stamped off toward the spring, muttering as he went. An hour later he returned puffing, his face purple with exertion, and there, coming to meet him, was Brighty, wide-eyed and innocent. In anger, the man threw one of the tins at the burro, who dodged it as artfully as if it had been a rock slide on a canyon trail. Then he hightailed it for the meadow. Later, when the man strode over to Uncle Jim's to tell on Brighty, there was just the hint of a smile on Uncle Jim's face as he listened. "Now, ain't that a fine way to do?" he said in a tone of a parent whose boy had smashed a window. "I'll have a talk with Brighty about this." But when the man was out of earshot, Uncle Jim slapped Brighty's hip in relief. "Praises be," he laughed. "If you'd answered to the prod and stick, I'd sworn the world was coming to a no-good end." Now comes the next chapter, okay? Let's try this one. Within the Black Tunnel. Summer faded the Indian paintbrushes, and the grasses dried so that there was little taste left in them. Nights grew cold and laid a breath of hoarfrost on the meadow. Brighty took to sleeping in an old cliff dwelling where he could nestle into the dry leaves that whirled in through the opening. But as the weather sharpened, mountain lions often left their tracks close to his sleeping place, and coyotes and wolves grew bolder. And when one day Brighty's whiskers were iced by the moisture of his own mouth, his mind began pulling him toward the canyon. Down there, the wind would blow warm over his body, and the sand would scratch him pleasantly, and there would be water running night and day, and with never a skim of ice on it. Suddenly he seemed driven to leave the rim top, and he started out, his feet hurrying him toward his warm winter house. As Brighty went by the cabin, Uncle Jim happened to glance out the window. He was standing at the table pouring a cup of coffee for the sheriff, who had come to pay him a visit, and he stopped with the cup only half full. Puzzled, the sheriff followed Uncle Jim's gaze. "Rope him, you dang fool," he said. "Don't just stand there goggle-eyed." Uncle Jim put down the coffee cup and hurried to the door. His hand rose to his mouth, and he started to call out, but something made him change his mind. "Goodbye, feller," his lips said. "I'll be seeing you again when the lupine blues." He stood silent in the doorway, watching Brighty step lightly along, head nodding, ears flopping. He watched until the small gray figure was swallowed by the forest gloom. "Who can rope a wild, free spirit?" he asked with a little burst of pride. The sheriff let out a snort. "Humph!" he exploded. "Who am I to say? I can't even rope a killer I know is crawling somewhere in the canyon. It's been 10 months since Old Timer was murdered, and I ain't found the killer yet." All that winter, Brighty roamed the inner reaches of the canyon alone. Sometimes when the wind was still, he thought he heard voices like his own on the mesa across the big river, but soon the wind would strike up and the voices would be lost in it. Snow fell again on the rim top and sifted down, building again the white fence, pinning him into the canyon. No human beings angled down this trail, and the days drifted by like slow-moving clouds. One day, toward spring, when Brighty was skirting the snow line, he took a notion to make a trip all the way down to the Colorado River. Just as day was breaking, he set forth. Bright Angel Creek tumbled over the rocks and babbled to him as he went along. The noise it made shut out the rumble of thunder, and he felt the small rain on his nose before he saw it. At first, it was not much more than a splash. Then there was more splashes, scattered here and there in the dust of the trail, but by and by the drops smalled, coming closer and closer together, and then the fury of the storm suddenly let loose. Great inky clouds rolled down from the summits, lightning flashed in yellow veins, joining crag to crag, thunder roared, and torrents of water spilled from the heavens. They sluiced over Brighty's head and funneled into his ears. They spouted down the hairy watershed over his eyes. The wind worked with the rain, blowing and battering at him, then swirling a gray curtain around him until it was too thick to see it through. He slipped on a rock and fell to one knee while the rain pummeled him and seeped through his hair and into his skin. He scrambled up and went groping blindly, letting his feet see for him, letting them feel their way along. Some homing instinct seemed to guide him, for all at once he found himself on the ledge leading to the little Mimi mine, and then he was ducking his head in and under the rough-hewn entrance of the black tunnel. A stench rose to his nostrils, not just of foxes come and gone and their droppings left behind, but a man smell that pulled the trigger in his mind. Except for the rain, he would have fled from the tunnel, but he was cold and wet, and the tunnel was warm and dry. He wiggled in and suddenly felt 2 human hands striking at his chest. They were trying to push him out of the tunnel into the rocks below. With a startled scream, Brighty struck down with his head, hitting the man's head. It was a dull echo in the tunnel. He sledgehammered again and again until he felt the hands lose their force. As he came into the darkness, he could sense the man backing away, keeping distance between them. The tunnel was quiet now, except for the rain gushing down over the entrance. But away from the rain, he heard a smaller sound, a steady, ticking sound that he remembered. He sank to the floor in exhaustion, listening. All that night there was no let-up to the storm. It loosened boulders and went and sent them crashing down the cliffs until the floor of the tunnel quaked. Brighty slept fitfully, waking to the rock slides and to his hunger gnawing. A sourdough biscuit was flung in his direction, but it smelled of dead beaver, and he only nosed it. With the morning, the rain petered out, and a murky light filtered into the tunnel. It outlined the figure of a man, and what he was doing touched off a small, sharp message to Brighty. He was winding a shiny gold watch with a gold key. Ooh, we know who that is. There he is. He was hanging out in the tunnel in the mine. Uh-oh. Well, that's it for now. Back with more later. Bye.